He froze in place when a wild Mustang appeared in front of his secluded cabin, and at that instant, he knew his battle for survival was only beginning. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. The night winds roared like a chorus of hungry wolves against the cedar planks of his cabin. Jack Calloway, a retired veteran who had chosen the solitude of these high plains for their supposed peace, pressed his ear to the window, straining to see through the swirling gale of snow that battered the glass. The moon was hidden behind dense clouds, and the only light was the weak glow from his lantern, flickering on the wooden table behind him. The storm had been raging for hours, piling drifts against the door and creeping along the windows, threatening to entomb him in ice if he dared to wait much longer. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, one that had nothing to do with the plummeting temperature. Something beyond mere weather weighed heavily on his mind, a gut feeling that war-honed. Instincts told him to trust. He recalled the days when he was pinned down under enemy fire in a foreign land, exhaustion bearing down on him like a leaden weight. That same sense of heightened awareness prickled through him now as the wind shrieked outside. This was nature's bombardment, and he was just as outmatched as he'd ever been on a battlefield. He ran his calloused fingers over the braided rope on his belt, checking his gear the way he once checked his rifle. A canteen of water, a flashlight whose batteries were already weak, a half-broken compass, and a small hunting knife. These items were precious lifelines out here in the endless drifts of white. The radio on his mantle produced only static. No rescue, no help from a world that might as well have been galaxies away. He felt the sting of the cold even within the cabin, and the meager fire crackling in the stone hearth did little to keep the chill from creeping under his flannel shirt. Outside, the wind battered the wood as if trying to rip the walls apart. He knew the storm was capable of lasting days, burying him and anyone else who hadn't found solid shelter. But there had been something in the corner of his eye, a strange movement through the whirling veil of snow. He peered outside again, pressing his forehead to the icy window pane and spotting a faint shape. His pulse quickened, a flash of adrenaline surging through him. It was large, standing on 4 legs, but it wasn't just any creature. It was a horse, wild, untethered, its mane and tail thrashing like dark flags in the tempest. Why would, say, Mustang be lingering near a cabin instead of seeking shelter? The question gnawed at him. The horse stood there in the knee-deep snow, almost motionless, gazing toward his window. Jack's breath fogged the glass, and for a moment he wondered if his fatigue and the swirling shadows were conjuring illusions. Yet every time the wind gusted, he caught another glimpse of that proud silhouette. If the horse was indeed real, what was it doing here? Memories of lonely nights in forward operating bases flickered through his mind, times when he'd sworn he could see phantom shapes in the darkness that turned out to be nothing. Yet he had the same feeling now, that jolt of awareness, that certainty that something was beckoning him to come outside. His hand twitched near the rifle propped by the door, not out of malice but out of old habit. The horse, if it was truly there, seemed to demand no aggression from him. It wasn't racing off in fear, nor was it charging. It merely waited in the raging blizzard. Jack inhaled deeply, seeing no sense in letting his terror of the storm hold him prisoner. If the Mustang was real, if it needed help or was trying to show him something, he had to investigate. Any other day he might have ignored it. But the uneasy sensation in his stomach told him there was something more out there. He tugged on his thick jacket, slipped his feet into heavy boots, and yanked the door open. A wall of icy air slapped him in the face, nearly forcing him a step back. Snow had piled halfway up, requiring him to stomp it down just to get across the threshold. Closing the door behind him, he trudged forward, each footstep plunging into deep, freshly accumulated drifts. The wind howled, sweeping crystals of snow across his face like tiny shards of glass. His breath came out in harsh, ragged bursts, and he had to squint hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The horse was still there, an unwavering figure in the storm, waiting as if it had all the time in the world. Jack's heart pounded as he forced himself closer. His nerves were on a knife's edge, expecting the animal to rear up or bolt at any second, yet it stood, shifting only slightly under the relentless barrage of wind and snow. He stopped within an arm's length, feeling the steamy heat of the horse's breath against the biting cold. Its eyes, dark and shining, were impossibly calm. Jack found his voice, a raspy echo against the wind. "What?" "What are you doing? Here?" The horse offered no reply, of course, just shook its mane. For a moment, man and beast stood locked in place, the storm swirling around them. Jack's eyelashes were freezing, and he could feel the numbness creeping across his cheeks. Here it felt like a test of wills. The Mustang gave a low snort, turned its head and looked over its shoulder, as if beckoning him to follow. The swirling gale concealed whatever lay beyond a few yards, but he knew the land well enough to guess there was little but rolling hills and scattered pine groves until the next valley. The horse let out another snort and took a few steps forward, then paused as if waiting for him to catch up. A primal sense of curiosity, perhaps even a sense of duty, spurred Jack onward. He followed, stumbling through the drifts with clumsy determination. Above him, the roar of the wind sounded like it would peel the flesh from his bones. Each step was a labor, cold seeping through his boots, turning his toes to ice. He cursed under his breath as the horse led him farther from the safety of his cabin. He feared losing sight of the creature, so he pushed faster despite the protest in his muscles. Occasionally the Mustang would glance back, making sure he was still coming. Jack tried to call out, but his voice was lost in the storm, carried away by the wailing gusts. At times, the horse would vanish behind a swirl of white, and Jack's heart would pound in his chest until the shape returned, beckoning him deeper into the raging chaos. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, he realized. The horse had led him to a different part of the property, one he rarely visited. Trees lined the edge of a small ridge, their branches heavy with snow, creaking ominously in the wind. The horse halted, and Jack nearly toppled forward, trying to see what had made it stop. Through the gale he thought he heard a faint cry, a sound too human to be the wind. He froze, every sense on edge. Had he truly heard someone's voice? He strained his ears, longing for that sound to repeat. The horse shifted anxiously, pawing at the snow. Jack held his breath, thoughts racing. The land around him was desolate, a blur of white. Nobody should be out here, especially in these conditions, but war taught him never to ignore a cry for help, no matter how impossible it might seem. Then he heard it again, a weak, muffled shout maybe. It was so faint he could barely be certain, but it was enough to make his pulse spike. Without conscious thought, he dug his hands into the pockets of his jacket, confirming he still had his rope and flashlight. He moved toward the sound, and the horse followed, flanking him as though offering protection. His boots slid on the icy ground beneath the snowdrifts, and he nearly fell into a ravine he hadn't seen. He steadied himself on a low branch, cursing at the near disaster. The horse let out an urgent neigh, and Jack peered over the edge. Through the swirling flakes, he could make out the shape of a person lying at the bottom. The ravine wasn't sheer, but it was steep and slick, and the figure below was motionless save for the occasional shudder. Jack's breath caught in his chest. Someone was down there, freezing, possibly injured. Another distant moan of pain or fear floated up to him. He didn't waste a second. He found a sturdy trunk at the lip of the ravine and tied off his rope. Throwing the other end down, he began to rappel, sliding on the icy rocks as he descended. The gusts whipped at him, making it difficult to keep his footing. More than once, he felt the rope slip in his gloved hands, and he had to clamp down with all his might to avoid tumbling headlong. Below him, the figure began to stir, a small whimper drifting into the chaotic wind. He reached the bottom at last, nearly sinking to his knees in the wind-packed snow. The darkness of the ravine walls cut the wind slightly, though the bite of cold was still brutal. He moved toward the shape and found a young girl, maybe 12 or 13 years old, partially pinned beneath a fallen branch. Her lips were blue, her eyes half closed in delirium. She wore a coat that was torn, offering little protection against the punishing weather. Her hair was frozen in icy clumps. Jack's heart clenched at the sight, paternal instincts he hadn't felt in years surging forward. He spoke gently, trying to keep his voice firm but comforting. "Hey, can you hear me? I'm here to help." She fluttered her eyes in response, not quite able to form words. He bent down, trying to lift the branch trapping her leg, but his numb fingers had little dexterity, and the wood was heavier than it looked. The girl let out a yelp of pain, and Jack paused. The angle was bad, and the trunk might shift in a way that would crush her further. He reached for his hunting knife, adrenaline spiking, and began hacking away at smaller branches, hoping to free her. Time blurred as he worked, each chop sending shockwaves up his arms. His breaths came in clouds of vapor, sweat freezing to his temples. He could feel his body's energy draining rapidly, sapped by the cold. His mind screamed at him to hurry. Survival was ticking away, both for him and for the girl. If he didn't get her out soon, her body would give in to the extreme temperatures. He dug feverishly at the snow, freeing more of her leg, but the trunk remained too heavy. He tried leverage with a snapped branch, only to find it splintering under the weight. Each failed attempt felt like a brutal reminder of his own limitations. Somewhere above, he heard the Mustang pacing at the ravine's edge, neighing as the wind whipped past. The horse's presence bolstered him somehow, a sign that he was not alone in this fight. He looked down at the girl, saw her eyes roll back, her body going limp. Panic seized him. He pressed a hand against her cheek. "Stay with me, kid," he murmured, forcing as much warmth and reassurance into his words as he could muster. But she was slipping away, her body giving out. He thought back to the field medic training he'd received decades ago. Shock, hypothermia. She was right on the brink. Jack renewed his assault on the branch, planting his feet firmly and applying all the force he could. His boots slid on the ice and he nearly lost his balance, but he clenched his jaw and tried again. He felt the trunk shift a few inches and the girl moaned softly. It wasn't much, but enough to free her leg a fraction. Blood seeped through her torn pant leg, the red stark against the white snow. He realized with grim certainty she needed immediate medical attention. Even if he freed her, getting her back up the ravine in this storm was another challenge entirely. His heart hammered, memories of fallen brothers on the battlefield creeping into his mind. He had once sworn that he'd never leave someone behind again, and he wasn't about to break that vow now. With a raw yell that seemed to tear from the depths of his being, he yanked on the trunk one more time, feeling his muscles scream. It moved, just enough for him to drag her out from under it. She cried out in pain as her pinned leg shifted, but he pulled her free. The branch settled with a crunch behind them, sending a small cloud of powdered snow into the air. Now, cradling the girl in his arms, he realized just how slight she was, maybe 80 or 90 pounds. He sank to one knee, still panting, trying to figure out the next step. A fierce gust howled overhead, reminding him there was no time to linger. He brushed the frozen strands of hair away from her face and felt a faint pulse at her neck. But she was fading fast. He had to get her warm and quickly. The rope was still tied above, but hauling them both up this slippery ravine in the middle of a blizzard seemed almost impossible. He considered his options, scanning the jagged walls for any easier path. Nothing stood out in the swirl of snow. With his teeth chattering and his hands trembling, he slung the rope around the girl's waist, tying a secure knot to keep her from slipping. His plan was to try inching up the ravine, using every bit of strength he had. It would be slow, grueling work. He wasn't sure if he could do it, but there was no alternative. Letting her freeze to death here was unthinkable. He placed his knife back in its sheath and tested the rope with his own weight. The battered trunk he'd anchored it to groaned but held. He positioned the girl, half lifting, half dragging her, as he took the first few steps up the icy slope. Each step required him to find a foothold in the snow or a crevice in the rock beneath. The wind up top scoured the edge, sending snow drifting over, and it cascaded down around them like a curtain of white. More than once, Jack slipped, and only the rope kept them from plunging back down to the bottom. His lungs burned with the effort, and his heart pounded in his chest, but he kept going, whispering encouragements to the unconscious girl, as if she could hear him. He thought he caught glimpses of that Mustang, its silhouette cutting through the storm, but he might have been hallucinating. The next step, then the next, he told himself, that was all that mattered. Minutes felt like hours until finally his hand grasped the lip of the ravine. He hauled the girl up first, pushing her over the edge to relative flat ground. Then he crawled the rest of the way, his body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exertion. He collapsed onto his back, sucking in harsh gulps of frigid air, the snow swirling above him. The girl was a few feet away, unmoving. He forced himself upright, crawling on hands and knees to check her. She was still breathing, but only barely. The horse appeared out of the white, as if conjured by the storm itself. It stomped and neighed, swirling its head back and forth. Jack wasn't sure if the Mustang was frightened or urging him on, but he knew he couldn't stay in the open. The cabin was at least a couple of 100 yards behind him in the raging blizzard, maybe more. He wasn't even sure of the exact direction anymore. Panic welled up inside him like a rising tide. He could get lost out here. He gritted his teeth, thinking of how many times he'd felt this despair in war and how many times he'd pushed through. He crawled to the girl, lifting her in his arms. The Mustang was so close now that he felt the warmth of its body. Could he place the girl on the horse's back somehow? The idea was wild, but the alternative was to carry her himself through the storm, an impossible feat. He stood on shaky legs, pressing one hand to the horse's shoulder. The Mustang, surprisingly, didn't shy away. Its coat was coarse and dusted with snow, but it stood solid as a rock. Jack, with as much gentleness as he could manage, tried to drape the girl across the animal's back. The horse let out a nervous snort, dancing a bit on the frozen ground, but it didn't bolt. Carefully, he arranged her so she wouldn't slip off, then looped his rope around the horse's neck, forming a makeshift hold. Jack ran his hand along the horse's side, murmuring softly. He felt no saddle, no bridle. This was a wild creature, yet in that moment it allowed him near, almost as if it understood the gravity of what was happening. Each blast of wind threatened to knock him over, but he clung to the rope. Taking a breath that felt like glass shards in his lungs, he gestured forward, and the Mustang began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped into the swirling white, and Jack stumbled behind, one hand on its flank to keep himself from falling. They pressed onward through the wind-lashed darkness. All sense of time vanished. Jack's mind focused on only one goal. Keep moving, don't stop, or you'll both freeze to death. Occasionally, the horse's hooves slipped on ice, and each time Jack's heart lurched, terrified the animal would topple and crush the girl. But the Mustang recovered each time with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. When Jack faltered, dropping to a knee in exhaustion, the horse paused, turning its head as if waiting for him to rise again. He spat out snow, forcing himself upright. The cold gnawed at his fingers and toes, making them burn, then go numb. He couldn't feel his face, and his breath came shallow and quick. The storm clawed at him, whispering that it would be so much easier to lie down and let the endless winter claim him. He bit down on his tongue, drawing a sting of pain to keep himself alert. He wouldn't let that happen. He was a soldier once, and soldiers didn't give up. No matter how bad it got, giving up was never an option. He cast a glance at the girl's pale face, pressed against the horse's back, and remembered the men he couldn't save in the field. He remembered how powerless he'd felt then, and how, despite that, he'd vowed never to abandon someone who needed him. The promise he'd made so long ago still lived in him like a spark. At some point he thought he glimpsed a faint light, a flicker through the swirling snow. At first he dismissed it as a trick of his frozen eyes, but as he stumbled another dozen steps, he saw it again, stronger this time. It was his cabin window, the lantern he'd left burning. Relief coursed through him, momentarily giving him new energy. "Come on," he croaked to the horse, though he could barely hear his own voice in the wind. The Mustang trudged forward, each step bringing them closer to shelter. When they finally reached the cabin, Jack realized just how deep the snow had piled. It nearly covered the lower half of the door. He scrambled ahead, clearing a path as best he could, ripping away chunks of the drift with his frozen hands. Each handful felt like clawing at shards of ice. The Mustang stood patient, holding its precious cargo. When he managed to yank the door open, a gust of slightly warmer air rushed out, a mere contrast to the savage cold outside. He grabbed the girl, trembling with exhaustion, and hauled her inside. The sudden change in environment disoriented him. The interior was dim and the meager fire had burned low. He laid the girl gently on a thick blanket by the hearth, then raced to throw more logs onto the embers. Sparks flared, and the flames licked up the new wood, hungrily devouring it. He stripped off his jacket, kneeling beside the girl to check her pulse. It was faint but still there. Her breathing was shallow. He grabbed more blankets and wrapped her tightly, rubbing her arms through the fabric, trying to coax warmth into her body. He remembered his first aid training. Cold kills, in stages, and the best chance of survival was gradual rewarming. He cursed himself for not having a proper medical kit, but he hadn't expected to be playing doctor in the middle of a raging winter storm. He tried to massage, feeling back into her numb limbs, mindful of her injured leg. She groaned once, eyes fluttering. Jack felt a surge of relief. She was still in there, fighting. He couldn't let her slip away. After a few minutes, he glanced at the door and realized the Mustang was still outside, standing in the storm. A part of him wanted to bring the horse inside too, but there was no room and it was a wild creature, yet it had saved them. He staggered to the doorway, bracing against the howling wind, and looked at the horse. It stared back, unblinking, its dark eyes reflecting a primal intensity. For a moment they regarded each other, the storm swirling between them. Jack wanted to say thank you or offer it some shred of comfort, but before he could act, the Mustang took a few steps backward, then turned and galloped into the night, vanishing in seconds. He stood there, breath hanging in the air, wondering if he'd just imagined the entire encounter. The hoofprints in the snow were proof enough, but already the wind was filling them in. If he didn't know better, he might have believed it was some ghostly guardian sent to guide him. But his priority now was the girl. He shut the door, forcing the storm out, and turned the lock. Then he dragged a chair over and jammed it under the handle in case the wind blew it open again. When he returned to the hearth, the girl was still unconscious, but color was slowly returning to her cheeks. The entire cabin felt colder than usual, as if the brief time he'd spent outside had allowed the temperature to drop dramatically. He checked his limited supplies, a few cans of soup, a kettle, some medical wraps he kept stashed away. He lit another lantern for additional warmth and light, wincing at the flickering shadows that danced on the rough walls. Sinking down, he took hold of her hand. It was stiff but no longer as icy as before. As the fire crackled, he found himself whispering, "Hang in there, kid. You're safe now." He hoped his words offered some measure of comfort, even if she was too far gone to hear them. Outside, the wind shrieked like a banshee, the cabin shuddering in protest. Snow spattered against the windows, forming a frosty film. Jack felt exhaustion crash over him like a wave, but he refused to give in to it. He rummaged for his flashlight and radio again, just in case by some miracle he could get a signal. Nothing, but static. He slammed it down in frustration. Hours passed in a blur of tending the girl and fighting off the bone-deep chill that permeated the cabin. Occasionally she stirred, soft moans escaping her lips. He tried to spoon small sips of water between them, mindful not to choke her. The storm showed no sign of letting up, and in his mind an unrelenting question took root. Who was she? How had she ended up out there alone? No child should be wandering in such deadly conditions. It felt like she was lost in a place where no living thing, human or animal, should roam during a blizzard. And yet, a Mustang had led him straight to her, as if fulfilling some divine directive. He dozed in and out, never fully letting himself succumb to sleep, each time jolting awake at the slightest shift of her body or change in her breathing. Eventually, his survival instincts took over, driving him to check the door and windows, making sure the storm wasn't piling up snow that could collapse the roof or force its way inside. He tested the thickness of the cabin walls, listening for any telltale groans. The building was sturdy, built by his own hands, but nature was a formidable adversary, one that had no regard for human life. By the time a faint glow of dawn permeated the swirling grey sky, Jack felt like he'd been through a battle more harrowing than any firefight he could remember. His limbs ached, his eyes burned, and his throat was raw from breathing the frigid air. He crawled over to the girl again, checking for vital signs. Her pulse was stronger, her breathing less shallow. It gave him hope. He tried to wake her, speaking softly near her ear. Slowly her eyelids fluttered open, revealing a pair of pale blue eyes filled with confusion and fear. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. He held a cup of water to her lips, helping her take a sip. She coughed and tears welled in her eyes. After a moment she rasped, "Where am I?" Jack introduced himself, stating that she was safe now, in his cabin. He could see panic rising in her expression, so he gripped her hand gently, offering what reassurance he could. The storm still howled outside, but at least in here, she wasn't alone. He asked her name, but she only shook her head, eyes squeezed shut, as if trying to block out a nightmare. He realized she might be in shock or suffering from trauma. It would take time for her to be coherent enough to explain what had happened. For now, survival was the only priority. He managed to get her to swallow a little bit of warm soup, though it was mostly broth. The color in her cheeks grew slightly warmer, and she began to shiver, a sign that her body was slowly fighting the cold. Jack wrapped another blanket around her and fed the fire more wood, determined not to let the flames die out. Hours passed like this, a tense vigil punctuated by the roar of the unending storm. He felt the cabin structure tremble occasionally, the wind testing every log and beam. This wasn't the gentle snowfall people romanticized. This was nature's fury in its purest form, and it demanded respect. He remembered the Mustang's eyes in the night, that steady gaze, and wondered where it had gone. Was it finding shelter for itself, or was it wandering through the drifts, guided by some unknown instinct? At some point, the girl's breathing evened out, and Jack let himself rest against the rough wall, cradling the rifle on his lap. He didn't expect any human threat, but old habits died hard. He shut his eyes for a brief, blissful moment. The warmth of the flames lulled him into a half-sleep, and despite his best intentions to stay alert, his body finally forced him to take a break. In that in-between state, he dreamed of the war, of lost friends, and of riding a horse across a blasted desert, chased by relentless enemies. He jerked awake to the sound of the girl moaning. She was moving again, blinking at the firelight. He forced himself upright, ignoring the protests of his stiff muscles, and crept to her side. She gazed at him with terrified eyes, as if unsure whether he was a friend or foe. In a soft tone, he told her who he was again, reassuring her she was safe. This time she seemed to comprehend a bit more. She whispered her name, Hannah. Relief washed over him. "Hannah," he repeated gently, giving her a nod. He asked if she remembered what happened, but her brow furrowed. She recalled leaving, home in a truck with her father, heading out to visit a relative or a friend, she wasn't quite sure. Then the storm struck. The vehicle lost traction, sliding off the road. She remembered a crash, confusion, crawling out into the freezing wilderness. Everything after that was a blur of snow, cold, and pain. Jack's heart sank as he imagined the horror of it. She was lucky to be alive, but what of her father? Hannah's eyes filled with tears, and she tried to sit up, but pain shot through, her leg bringing a strangled cry to her lips. Jack put a calming hand on her shoulder, gently lowering her back down. He examined the injury more closely now that he had better light. There was a deep bruise and a nasty cut, but it didn't look like the bone was shattered, at least not from the outside. Regardless, she couldn't walk on it, especially not in the middle of a raging blizzard. He assured her they would search for her father once the storm subsided enough to travel safely. Hannah's tears spilled over, and Jack felt a pang of empathy that cut deeper than any knife. He thought of his own younger sister, long gone, how he used to comfort her when she was frightened. He gently wiped the tears from Hannah's face with a corner of the blanket, telling her he'd do everything in his power to help her find her dad. He prayed silently that the man was still out there, maybe holed up somewhere. But a voice inside whispered the odds were not in his favor. The storm raged on hour by hour, refusing to yield. Jack and Hannah shared what little food he had, rationing it carefully. She slept fitfully, and so did he, jolting awake periodically to add more wood to the fire or check the howling world outside the window. The snow had piled up so high that only the top half of the glass pane was visible. He dreaded the possibility that the storm might last another day or two, cutting them off completely. The question of how to find her father hovered over him, like a storm cloud of its own. Eventually there was a lull, an eerie silence that replaced the constant wail of the wind. Jack peered outside to see if the storm had finally passed. The sky was still a swirl of grey, but the gusts had died down to occasional blasts, and the snowfall eased to a steady drift of flakes. It wasn't exactly safe, but it was better than the near-hurricane conditions from before. He left Hannah with enough wood to keep the fire alive, instructing her to stay put. She was awake but weak, her eyes full of pleading worry as he prepared to venture out once again. He promised he would search the road where she said the crash had happened, maybe a mile or two away. She nodded, tears forming again, but she didn't protest. He could see she didn't have the strength to argue or to come with him. Without any more words, he stepped outside, rifles slung across his back, rope and flashlight in hand. He was met with waist-high drifts that he had to wade through. The cabin door nearly got stuck in the packed snow, and he had to force it shut behind him. The world was blanketed in white, the sky matching the ground in a seamless horizon. He tugged his hood tighter, bracing for the cold that still lingered in the air. He started his trek, every muscle protesting the effort of pushing through the snow. His boots sank deep, forcing him to lift each leg high, a march that was slow and punishing. The road, if it existed under all that ice, would be a challenge to find. He used landmarks, boulders, stands of pine trees, and the curvature of the land to guide him, recalling the route from memory. As he rounded a small grove of trees, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye, a dark shape on a ridge not far away. He stiffened, heart beating faster. It was the Mustang, the same horse that had led him to Hannah, standing with its head held high, mane catching the gentle breeze. Its presence filled him with a sense of awe and gratitude he couldn't quite articulate. He offered a silent thanks, but before he could move toward it, the Mustang jerked its head and took off across the ridge, disappearing over the other side. Jack was left standing in the swirling flakes, wondering if it was urging him to follow. He decided to continue on the path toward the road. After nearly an hour of trudging, slipping, and nearly losing his balance several times, he spotted a dark shape half buried in the snow. As he drew closer, his stomach knotted. It was the wreck of a pickup truck, nose down in a shallow ditch. A few branches snapped off the pine trees above. He quickened his pace, heart thudding. The passenger door was flung open, glass shattered. Snow had poured inside, covering the seats. He circled around to the driver's side, seeing the figure slumped over the wheel, unmoving. Jack sucked in a breath, steeling himself. He reached out, brushing snow off the driver's shoulder. The man's lips were pale, eyes frozen open in a final expression of pain and panic. Jack didn't need a pulse check to know he was gone. His throat tightened, thinking of Hannah back at the cabin, hoping her father might still be alive. Cold reality crashed in. Gently, he pressed the man's eyes closed, feeling a wave of anger and sadness. The storm had claimed another life. Was it merciful to let her keep hoping, or should he tell her the truth? He took a moment to search the truck for any supplies. He found an old blanket, a first aid kit, and a half-empty thermos of frozen coffee. Nothing that would revive a dead man or lessen the brutal finality of what had happened. He tried to pull the driver's body free, hoping to give him a proper burial, or at least move him somewhere more dignified than the front seat of a mangled vehicle. But the man was pinned, and the door refused to open further. In the end, Jack bowed his head, saying a quiet prayer, his breath puffing in the icy air. He would have to come back later once the storm truly passed to do things right. Despondent, he trudged back the way he came, glancing now and then at the ridge to see if the Mustang reappeared. It didn't, leaving him alone with the cold and the tragedy he carried in his heart. By the time he reached the cabin again, his body was on the verge of collapse. He forced the door open, met by a rush of warmth from the fire and the worried gaze of Hannah. She took one look at him and knew. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and Jack knelt beside her, cradling her head gently, wishing he had better news. He told her in the softest way he could that her father didn't survive. She sobbed, clutching the blanket, every raw emotion pouring out in broken cries. He stayed with her, letting her release the grief. There were no words that could make it better, no miracle he could perform to undo what had happened. All he could do was hold her hand and be present, a surrogate guardian in a world that had just turned brutally dark for her. After a while, her sobs subsided into quiet whimpers, her tears spent. She looked at him, eyes red-rimmed, and asked how she could possibly go on. Jack could only manage a thick swallow, blinking away his own tears. He told her about the Mustang, how it had led him to her, how it refused to leave until she was safe. Maybe there was a reason for that, a reminder that she still had a life worth fighting for. She closed her eyes, nodding slowly, as if clinging to the idea that something divine or magical had intervened. Days passed in the cabin. The storm eventually eased, and the sun broke through the endless cloud cover, revealing a landscape transformed by towering snowdrifts and ice-laden trees. In that time, Jack tended to Hannah's injuries, feeding her and keeping her warm. Her leg started healing, albeit painfully. She could hobble with his support, but still needed to rest. The radio continued to churn static, but he kept trying. Finally, on the third day, the static gave way to a faint signal, and he managed to transmit a mayday call. Rescue came in the form of a snowplow and an emergency vehicle that crawled up the back roads. Hannah was taken to the nearest hospital for proper care. Jack accompanied her, refusing to let her face the aftermath alone. The ordeal had bonded them in a way neither fully understood. Doctors said she'd make a full recovery physically, though emotionally the scars of losing her father would take much longer to heal. Jack felt a heavy sadness as he arranged the man's funeral in a small local cemetery. Hannah stood by the grave, leaning on crutches, tears freezing on her cheeks in the frosty air. Jack's hand rested on her shoulder, silently offering what solace he could. In the weeks that followed, Jack opened his home to her, helping her navigate the complicated processes of child services paperwork and the question of who would take her in. She had an aunt in another state, but until that was settled, Jack was her guardian. Their days were filled with the slow rhythms of recovery, physical therapy for her leg, quiet moments by the hearth where they shared stories. She learned about his time in the military, how he'd seen loss before and how it never truly stopped hurting. He learned about her love of animals, how she once volunteered at a local stable and how she adored horses. Ironic, she said, considering a wild Mustang had effectively saved her life. Sometimes she'd ask him if the horse might come back. He wasn't sure what to say. He'd seen it only once more since that night, a fleeting glimpse on a far hill, almost like an apparition watching from a distance. He told her it might always be out there running free, reminding them that even in the darkest storms, hope could appear in the most unexpected form. She seemed to take comfort in that, though her eyes still bore the weight of sorrow. Finally, the day came when her aunt arrived, driving up the long, winding road to Jack's cabin. Hannah greeted the woman with a timid hug. Jack helped load her belongings into the trunk, a small suitcase, a handful of personal items from her old life. The goodbyes were tearful. She clung to him, whispering a shaky thank you for saving her. He stroked her hair and reminded her that the Mustang was the real hero. He was just the one stubborn enough to follow its lead. She gave him a watery smile, promising to stay in touch. As the car pulled away, Jack stood on his porch in the crisp winter air, thinking about how much had changed since that night. The quiet solitude he once cherished seemed emptier now. The presence of another human being, someone who needed him, had filled a void he hadn't realized was there. A swirl of snow danced across the yard, and he imagined it forming the shape of a horse. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind, half expecting to hear distant hoofbeats. He spent the rest of that winter in a strange state of reflection, the cabin feeling both too big and too small at the same time. Sometimes he'd walk the perimeter of his land, scanning for tracks. He found hoofprints occasionally, leading nowhere in particular, disappearing in a stand of pine or over a snowbank. It was as though the Mustang still roamed, watchful and free, unconstrained by fences or fear. It became a symbol for him, a living testament that miracles could appear in the midst of life's worst storms. One cold morning, after weeks of no contact, his radio crackled. It was Hannah. She'd convinced her aunt to take her to a place where she could radio him through a local station. Her voice, though crackling with static, was strong. She told him she missed the cabin, missed the sense of safety she felt there, despite the terror of that blizzard. She asked if he'd seen the Mustang again. He paused, gazing out the window at the frost-covered landscape, and told her not recently, but he felt sure it was still out there. He could hear the smile in her voice even through the interference, and it warmed a part of him that had gone cold years ago. When spring finally approached, the snows began to melt, revealing patches of green grass across the plains. Jack's routine returned to the quiet tasks of chopping wood, hunting for fresh game, and occasionally driving into town for supplies. But he found himself scanning the horizon more often, hoping for a flash of a dark mane against the brightening sky. He never fully stopped expecting the Mustang to reappear, and in quieter moments, he told himself that if it did, he'd be ready to greet it properly. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the fields, he glimpsed movement by the old fence line. His heart skipped. There, nibbling at the fresh shoots of grass, stood the Mustang, regal as ever, its coat gleaming in the golden light. He slowly walked toward it, stopping a respectful distance away. The horse lifted its head, ears twitching, watching him intently. He had no rope, no halter, nothing to restrain it. He had learned by now it wasn't meant to be owned or tamed, not entirely. He raised a hand in greeting, and the Mustang stomped a hoof as if acknowledging him. They stood like that for a full minute, man and horse bound by a moment of silent understanding. In that quiet exchange, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the horse's intervention that night, but for everything it represented. Second chances, faith, resilience. Eventually, the Mustang turned and trotted away, mane catching the wind, disappearing behind the ridge as it had done before. Jack stayed rooted to the spot for a while, the breeze ruffling his hair, a faint smile playing on his lips. He thought of Hannah, picturing her healing, growing stronger, finding ways to cope with her loss. In many ways, he realized, their bond was like the Mustang, unbroken by distance or time, formed by an extraordinary circumstance that neither could fully explain. He made a silent promise to write her soon, to keep their connection alive. The sun dipped further below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, and he headed back to the cabin, a subtle lightness in his step. In the coming days, he made arrangements to travel and visit Hannah and her aunt, to pay respects at her father's gravesite. But before he left, he took a final walk around the perimeter of his property, looking for footprints or hoofprints in the softening ground. There were none that day, but he knew the Mustang was out there. Some things were not meant to be pinned down, only appreciated when they graced you with their presence. As he locked the cabin and placed the key in his pack, he took one last look at the rolling plains. Then he headed out, ready for whatever new chapter life had in store. If this story has left you in awe, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear a tale of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. We upload stories every day at the same time, and we want you to be part of our journey. Let us know your thoughts, your own stories, and join us again for another gripping adventure where courage, resilience, and the unexpected can change lives in an instant.